Thanks everyone for joining. Before we get started, just some basic housekeeping items. So first of all, this is being recorded and it'll be available and shared with you in a few days. All attendees are on mute for today's Q&A, but we want this to be as interactive as possible. So at any time, feel free to enter any questions you might have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. All right. Hello, everyone. I am Jill Muselar, Director of Product Marketing here at Imperity. I've been in the CDP space for the past 2 years after spending a few decades in customer data, retail, consumer goods as a marketer. And I am excited to be joined today by Marcus Owens and Caleb Benningfield. I will let you two go ahead and introduce yourselves. Marcus, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
Great. Hi, my name is Marcus. I'm a solution consultant here at Imperity. I've been with the company a little over a year now, and just excited to be on our second session to dive a little bit deeper into the CDP space and what we're seeing out there.
Love it. My name is Caleb Benningfield. I think my official title is Principal Solution Architect at Imperity, but I'm been here for the majority of the life of the company and sort of focus on data architecture questions and working on kind of the deeper research and development projects.
Fantastic. Thank you both. For anyone joining us who's not familiar with Imperity, we are a customer data platform. We work with over 400 leading brands such as T-Mobile, Alaska Airlines, Dick's Sporting Goods, and Planet Fitness. So just to get us started, Marcus, as you referenced, you and I spoke a few weeks ago about defining that unified customer view. This is a phrase that has become really ubiquitous across so much of MarTech and even ad tech lately. But every customer or every vendor and software provider has a slightly different definition. So in our conversation, we were trying to define that, right? And we came to our definition as being inclusive of all the omnichannel and behavioral data, being accurate, that it has to have a robust identity resolution solution ingrained to link all those records together and stitch them. And then 3, that it has to have a level of transparency, right? A black box is not really a unified customer view, or we don't have proof that it is. And so therefore, the next step in that conversation is to talk today about how we define a CDP and how that unified view plays a role in the CDP. What are the products and features to look for? And so I'm hoping that we can kind of boil down to a similarly simple list. But before we do that, probably the best place to start is to talk about all those different types of CDPs. The space has exploded in the past few years, close to 200 different brands calling themselves a CDP. Definitely not homogenous, lots of features and capabilities and approaches. So Marcus, I'd love it if you would just take us through how you view those different types of CDPs.
Yeah, everybody wants to be a CDP, right? So why would you want to be a CDP? No, I absolutely, it's a great way to think about it because, as we watched the space evolve, what we kind of saw were, really were 3 kind of distinct lanes that true CDPs really seem to fit into. The first is what we might call like a data pipe or a routing based CDP, right? And these are, sometimes recovering tag managers, right? And they're really good at, moving data quickly and moving it from one place to another, that momentary experience economy, that focus. One of the things that we're finding they lack is really that really accurate understanding of the customer. And then also the flexibility to bring in data sources that aren't maybe digital native, right? So really struggle with handling offline data or really unifying that offline to online journey and understanding what that looks like. Speaking of journeys, the second category we're seeing these really activation and journey focused CDPs, right? A lot of these have been born out of the attempt to bring together a marketing cloud into a CDP or something along those lines. And, their focus is really on the marketer and on giving them oftentimes a very visual experience to discover as well as kind of activate those customer journeys. And it's really compelling. And there's some cases in which those make a lot of sense. But what we're finding is a similar problem is that if you don't solve that kind of unified customer problem, you don't solve that identity problem, you don't really have the right type of customer data feeding those journeys. So you're driving journeys that are based off of, a fragmented version of me that thinks that I'm a churned customer instead of a high value customer, for example. And then lastly, you've got your end-to-end CDPs, which end-to-end is a pretty generous term, right? But these are CDPs that are really more focused on what CDPs actually are, the customer data platform. If you notice, like a lot of what I talked about before was about moving data or activating journeys. It wasn't about the customer data at its core, at its foundation. So we're seeing, this space becoming more and more important as customers start to realize that they've got a great way to move data. They got a great way to build these customer journeys, but the customer data that's powering all of it, it isn't accurate, it isn't accessible, and they're not really easily able to add value to it that allows them to drive those really dynamic experiences.
Thank you. That is a good succinct list. I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm excited to bring Caleb into this conversation. Caleb, I think you were employee number 4 around Imperity. My guess is you've probably implemented or been involved in the implementation of more CDPs than maybe possibly anyone. So you were here before Imperity was known as a CDP. Why is Imperity a CDP now, and which type do we roll into that Marcus just described?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, the odd part about the CDP label is, I think the label showed up before the software did in a lot of ways. It was sort of an idea. It was about, well, we need to, right now we only have portions of our data and we really need to have a comprehensive view. And if we can think about all of the exciting things we could do, right? And I think it was derived from the value of all of these activation platforms. So, when we started Imperity, the prior startup with the same founders was a company called Aperture. It was a marketing automation style tool that would compete with something like an ExactTarget. And our big experience with that was that the industry had grown really comfortable with an adage that people repeated all the time, which was garbage in, garbage out. And so the efficacy of a platform, an email platform that builds journeys, is as good as the data that goes into it. If you put in duplicate data, you put in incomplete data, you're going to send too many emails. They're going to be, the personalization is going to be invalid, that kind of thing. And so, outside of the email channel, there were channels for the digital channels and for, customer service and all these things. And all of those tools have their own data model. And basically, when you read the pitch, it says, write a bunch of ETLs and get the data in here. And that's a very complicated thing to do in reality. And most companies don't have access to the types of teams necessary for that. So before the CDP, label showed up, Imperity, we built this to solve that problem. We referred to it as solving the customer data problem, which is build an actual data platform that takes all of the different types of customer data, regardless of whether it was collected on a website or in a store via support interactions, and has best-in-class tooling for turning that into one cleaned up, useful data set. Basically, allowing us to stop that cycle of garbage in, garbage out, putting out something that's actually, really clean, and then building as many tools as possible to let you pump it into all of these SaaS tools. Because one of the things that's very common, that you just got to get used to is change in this market. TikTok didn't exist that really when Imperity started, right? But now it's one of the most popular channels that you can market on. And so there's over time, you're going to have different channels show up, different strategies, but we believe that ultimately you need to have the best data for that. So I would put us in that end-to-end CDP bucket, because effectively we really do focus on all of the data, and it's customer domain specific, and it is a data platform meant to be built on. And so I do think that's where we showed up in there. Ultimately, I maintain that the first two categories Marcus described don't make good on the core label. They either are not customer data focused, or they are not a data platform, because they have limits to what you can store in them and limits to what you can build on them. And they have far more in common with either real-time infrastructure or like the marketing clouds. Whereas I think we're trying to sort of flip the old model of ETL and data management on its head.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I was gonna, as you were talking, one thing I was noticing that was missing from that list was the approach of putting together all those components yourself and being able to piece together a solution. I know I've heard you, Caleb, talk passionately about this topic. I wonder what you'd like to, if you'd have to add anything about that sort of building your own CDP approach.
Yeah, I mean, basically what I'll kind of throw in here is it's one of the most common, most complex conversations that I ever have, because effectively most companies are not software companies at their core. So you have a product company, and maybe they have a hotel chain, and so they specialize in providing great experiences and comfortable rooms, keeping the rooms filled, that kind of stuff. Like and all of the technology around it is sort of second to the product, right? And so as a result, most enterprise companies have maybe an IT team that focuses on some data that might be separate from their web team, that might be separate from their analytics team, that might be separate from their marketing team. And so each of them understand the platforms that are useful to them, and often they don't even really know or have a clear picture of like the zoomed out view of their overall data management. So I always feel like starting from there is kind of important to understanding the difficulty of that build versus buy type of conversation, which is, you know, ultimately on a very high level, you collect data somewhere on your website, from support interactions, wherever. You need to get it all into one spot, but all of that data, when you get it into one spot, is shaped however it was captured. And then you have to understand every single piece of data and resolve that, do your identity resolution, generate your single view of your customer. And then you need to take that data and you need to make it available to all of those other teams. And so ultimately, you need something that can sort of bridge that gap. And you know, we're like the options for constructing your own still effectively equate to buying 3, 4, 5, 6 different platforms, and that they're arguably an evolution of the legacy model of writing everything via code. Maybe you eliminate some of the tedium, but you're dealing with a burden that is still siloed. Your marketing team is still only using these tools, and your IT team is still only using those tools, and it just makes it really difficult for the market. And so, but those component solutions are easier to consume. So ultimately, it's just one of the most nuanced elements of the conversation. And I think to people who have done it the old way, they tend to really understand the imperative bias towards how we are solving it. But we also think that there's a lot out there where, you know, they take the old model, they shine it, they put a nice little label on it, and they put it out as though they've innovated in some way. And really, all they've done is eliminate some tedium along the way. And I think that that's made it a bit of a minefield for customers.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One challenge I could see, or I think that we sometimes hear, is from brands that we're talking to that already has one or more of those up to 6 tools that you called out. If you've already got one of those, is it going to limit the ROI you could get from buying the prepackaged CDP? One example, Marcus and I had talked about the DMP, and if it doesn't really unify first party data. And so could you swap out the DMP? But if that might be a 1-for-1 swap, but what if you've already got like a data warehouse, for example? How does that help or hurt the ROI from a CDP purchase?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to view each component as for what it actually does. So, for example, a data warehouse just stores data. There is nothing about a data warehouse that has anything specific to customer data or the customer domain or the use cases you want to do, which means that anything that you do with it will either require you to use a second tool, or you will have to write from the ground up code for a problem that has probably been solved thousands of times across the industry. So you can store all the data in your data warehouse, but then you have to go through and say, which ones have customer data? Great. Where's my PII? Where's my loyalty data? Where's my transaction data? How does this, my point of sale store transactions different from my e-commerce data? And you have to like write models and rules and all of these things along the way for every single bit if you wanted to try to build it on a data warehouse. And so you could either combine all of these things, or you can buy something that does it all in one place. I think that even if you were to sort of snap your fingers and build it, the end result is 5 or 6 tools that are good at what they are good at, and your team that maintains and supports that has to then understand 5 or 6 different tools. And so like the support burden becomes difficult. Change management becomes difficult, because if you accidentally misconfigure one of the 6 tools, you might end up breaking something that directly affects revenue or your customer's experience, right? And so ultimately, that maintenance monitoring piece is core, but and often the solution that I hear from the sort of build market is to just buy yet another tool and spend a ton of time integrating it into all of your component tools. So ultimately, it's sort of a Legos approach, but the Legos are all not made by the same Lego company. They're all different shapes. And so they all are built blocks, but like, one's a Duplo, one's a Lego, and you're sticking them together, and the end result is not as clean as the label would imply.
Yeah, I think that's what you've laid, the steps though you've laid out are a useful construct, right? Like it boils down to what Marcus and I talked about before. You got to bring the data in, you have to make it usable, you have to make it better, and then you use the data. If you go back to sort of the end-to-end CDP that we were talking about before, Marcus, I'd love to hear your opinion on, does every CDP do that list of things, and how do you start to differentiate who's good at that and determining for you what your needs are?
Yeah. I mean, the answer is no. Of course, they don't do it all the same way. The first hurdle that we see is something that Caleb kind of alluded to, right? Is how do I get the data into the system in the first place? There are a lot of CDPs out there that purport to do a lot of great things with customer data, but you got to get it there. And so a lot of times we see people that are saying, well, yeah, I'd love to leverage this different set of data. There's just no way for me to get it and reliably format it to the schema that I need to bring it into to get into that platform. So, can you find a CDP? Hint, hint, you can. That's going to take some of that burden off of you, right? And that also means that, Caleb talked about a lot of teams with a lot of needs for data. We're going to talk a little more about making it accessible to those teams. So let's talk about making the platform itself accessible to those teams in the first place by, enabling marketing teams to bring in sources of data to let them ask questions that might have been blocked to them because they had to put in a Jira ticket and wait for that to go through to IT and then wait for the data to get pulled and then wait for the data to get formatted and placed where they wanted. And before they knew it, it was past the time they wanted to run the campaign in the first place. The second piece, though, once you're really bringing all that data together, right, is, how do you actually make that data flexible and accessible to those different business units? So, one thing we hear, especially when we're talking about MDMs, MDM typically is going to have, if you're storing customer data there, a very one-dimensional, very operational, very inflexible view of the customer. So how do I start to create and enable different views of the customer that enable different use cases, right? So maybe if I'm calling into a customer service, I want a view of the customer that includes every different email or phone number I might have touched the customer with in the past, just so that they can give me any of those data points and I can access their full rich history. Maybe if I'm sending a campaign to Facebook or TikTok, I want to have multiple different versions of that customer PII so that I can maximize the chance of actually hitting that customer. Maybe my analytics team actually needs a version of the customer that has maybe just an anonymous ID, but none of the PII, because the analytics team can't touch PII and they're limited today because they can't get data that's really properly scrubbed in an efficient way. Right. So you got to have a platform that's going to really be able to handle all of those different things. We touched a little bit on governance, right? And that governance extends both to, multiple brands, right? So a lot of customers, have multiple brands they're trying to manage within a single CDP because they want to leverage some global insights, but also they need that governance, that ability to manage those brands in a different, format, et cetera, each level, right? So you want a tool that's going to support that as well. And then is the data and the view of the data, the view of the customers, are built in mind with sort of attributes and calculations that both out of the box and then make it, and then also custom attributes that are easy to build, easy to roll out. So when I want to add value to my data asset so that I can power those downstream platforms like an email and SMS delivery provider that doesn't want 4 years of transaction history. It wants easily segmentable attributes that it can then leverage for those customer journeys, right? Does it have the ability to both bring me a lot of that out of the box as well as make it easy to respect the ones that I have within my business and want to grow with my business? And then finally, we talked a lot about, everything within the CDP. How do you get the data out of the CDP? Is it a one way in, one way out situation where, I pump data in, I wait a predetermined amount of time, and then I just see what comes out the other end? Can I inspect what's going on at each stage of the process and not just inspect it, but use it? Right? If I have a tool that only needs that identity graph, do I have the flexibility to simply, pump that universal ID outside of the system? If I have a tool that only needs the customer 360, do I have the flexibility at every stage in that data life cycle to export the data that I own from a platform I'm paying for? It seems like a crazy question to have to ask, right? But there are cases in which you might find that you're limited in terms of how you can use your data and the places you can send it to. And then finally, when we're talking about activating these marketing campaigns, you want a tool that's going to make it easy for you to deliver data as it should be to bring data in. And that means having a data that can manage the flexibility of, Zendesk wants fundamentally different information than Facebook does, than Braze does, than Cordial does, et cetera, right? How do you make sure that you have a tool that can manage those different downstream platforms, manage the different formats that they need to see, and really integrate with them in a seamless way that's, takes that heavy lifting out of your hands?
That's a really good point. When to Caleb's earlier point about every day there's something new, and today it's TikTok and tomorrow it's who knows what. So yeah, constantly growing set of places to activate. Also really good list of questions. So, for the listeners, we'll tee that up and pull those together and send it out for you in a written format that's easier to consume if you didn't write all those down. I'd be curious, Caleb, anything else that you would add to that list of things to be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think you mentioned sort of the way the market continues to change there, and that's the stuff that kind of pops into my mind as being treated in a pretty second class way throughout the SaaS market. The amount of tools out there that where the strategy is effectively to tell you to do things what I would consider in production is pretty staggering, if I'm honest. Like, it's a dangerous thing to do. Like, if you're running all of your marketing, spending millions of dollars a year on things, and you're going to make a change in something that could break that, like, and not have a simple way to roll that back or a simple way to understand what changed. I think that most SaaS tools largely undercut that. And so I think that you either have to like maintain dev environment versions of things, and then you're building a bunch of effort to do change management and build processes and checkpoints along the way, or you're just doing it, in production and hoping that it all works. And that's that approach is fundamentally flawed. I also think that sort of anything about the data governance piece of it is pretty core. Like in the modern world, there's so much focus on where we're getting data, the push from third party to first party data, the rollout of GDPR and outside of the US, but then CCPA within the country is sort of core to what people have to do with all of this data and what they have to sort of live with and think about. And so really understanding exactly where your data is and how to act on it, and what interactions you've had with your customers is going to be core, because all of this will continue to evolve. We'll continue to see new channels, we'll see new laws, we'll see new things I haven't even thought of yet, especially as like generative AI comes out and stuff, where people will want to know whether or not their data is contributing to what models, right? So all of that is going to be core. So any CDP worth their salt is going to have a lot around sort of governance and change management, which are less visual, less sort of sexy features, but they're probably some of the most core to reducing pain and kind of maintaining velocity as the market continues to evolve.
Yeah, I mean, that I feel like you've highlighted a misconception around CDP, that a CDP is a marketer's tool, and that really, if you've got all the functionality you need, the use cases go well beyond the marketing team. I'm going to go ahead. As you were talking about some of the governance, I can see some questions from viewers coming in. So I think we've got that list is what I was hoping that we could get to. So let's just flip over, and maybe you've kind of answered some of this, but I'll just put it out there. How does a CDP help with privacy compliance with all of the new existing and the new laws that have been passing lately? I think more are coming.
Well, I would say I kind of draw it back to my distinction about, customer data platform, right? Like, it's data platform. You should be able to store everything relative to your customers, right? So CCPA, GDPR, it's what do you know about me? And I want you to forget me, like, effectively, which means you need to know what they, just answering the question of what do you know about me without having your data in like a single place, well managed. It's actually really hard to do that, because then what, you have to check 17 different tools and all the sources, and it just becomes an incredible burden that's generally impossible at any sort of scale. And so a good CDP will store all of your data, which means that you should be able to get what you need, do the validation workflow, and be able to serve up a comprehensive view of what you know to your customer, which is a little different from the personalization style workflows that we think about, but it's can massively reduce that burden, which can reduce the sort of legal risk and all of the stuff that can come along with that. Like, if you can very quickly identify what you know and also where to go delete it, then that makes your CDP kind of solve, or at least a really nice way to make that problem less painful.
Yeah, and I'll piggyback on that too, to say that, the CDP is really becoming, as that kind of core inflection point, it's also becoming that kind of core point of confusion when we start to see layering consents, right? So you need a CDP that's going to be flexible enough to understand what it means when, maybe I have data that I can use for analytics, but I can't use for activation. And how do I segment that data? How do I put that into place and use it in such a way where I'm still deriving value from it, but I'm also respecting, the use rights around that data, right? So a lot of those questions are, partly the CDP is answering.
Sure. Okay. We've got one more question and we can wrap it up. It's around multiple data sources and the challenges faced with consolidating those or combining them, and what kind of CDP would be a good fit with those multiple data sources.
I'll take a swing at that, and then Caleb, I'm sure you can have something to add there. We've talked a lot about, ingesting data and sources today. So, to rehash on that, obviously, a tool that is going to be as flexible as possible is going to help you bring in more sources that aren't neatly and nicely formatted for, our digital world or the way the computers think. And we've talked a lot about just raw data formatting, but the thing that we, haven't talked about much today that we go back to our first session to talk about is, are those tools going to be able to find linkages in the identity and find the, the Marcuses, the Jills, the Calebs across your data without the need for some sort of a linking key, right? Without the need for using third-party data, which we know, speaking of CCPA, GDPR, is becoming less and less useful and lower fidelity as time goes on. So you want to try to find a solution that really focuses on that identity resolution component in a way that's going to find those linkages when you've got messy data or incomplete data, because, not call any present company messy, but like humans are messy, right? We're incomplete people. Our data is a kind of a mess too. And so we need a system that's going to be able to tolerate that when you're trying to do this wonderful thing of bringing together online, offline, all these different behavioral and transactional insights.
Yeah, I mean, the main addition I'll put on there is, ultimately, if something is going to be a data platform, it has to be generic. Like it should store any kind of data you want. And a lot of the marketplace out there, is focused on the way that data moves quickly, or the way to activate on the data. But ultimately, they're either kind of biased towards more of a visitor point of view, which leaves all other interaction points as, second class or difficult to sort of jam into that model, or they require you to do a bunch of stuff outside. So you have to buy a CDP, and invest in an incredibly elaborate data management solution before that. And so ultimately, I think that flexibility is core, and being careful when you're looking at the market and understanding sort of what they're best at and whether or not that reflects the comprehensive way you interact with your customers is going to be really important.
Yeah, agreed. I think we'll go ahead and end here. We're at time, but I think this is a really great checklist, and we'll get that out to everyone listening in today. So thank you, Marcus and Caleb, very much, and thanks everyone for joining in and listening.
Thanks very much.
Thanks. Had fun.